I wanted to talk mainly about the American immigration text, which I'd like you to just read. And I'm not going to give you a test over it. It's not going to be, identify the various immigration acts of the Congress. I know that stuff information would just be forgotten as soon as you memorized it. So what's the point of reading this? Well, you should reach certain conclusions. You can reach your own. I'm going to give you some of mine from having read the text. Immigration has been essential for the financial and national success of the American dream or the American prosperity. People would try to turn off and on the spigot to say we need more. Like during World War I, World War II, the Bracero movement, I think they called it that during World War II, was to encourage Hispanic workers, Mexican workers to come into the United States and do a lot of the work because the men have been drafted to fight off against Japan and Germany and in Europe and all over the world. So there was a huge drain. I think about 12 million American soldiers, mostly men, obviously, served in World War II. That's a huge number of healthy young men that fought. So there was a need. So peculiar things would happen. For instance, certain groups would be declared white or not, because white was always acceptable, but if you were not classified as white, people didn't want you. For example, during the, people would make a difference between people from southern Italy versus northern Italy. So at times it would say, well, if they're from Rome and South or something like that, we don't want them. We want just Teutonic or German-like white Italians from the north of Italy. This whole color thing is just ridiculous. It was just made up. The same thing was done legally to declare Hispanics white or not white, depending on the need. So if they were white, they would just let them in without changing the law, and then they would send them back, like after World War I. It was interesting that the immigration policy of the British, when they had the American colonies, they wanted immigration. They obviously brought in slaves. That was not immigration, that was enslavement. But they also allowed people from Germany and the Netherlands and France and different places. Probably not so many French, because until France was no longer a threat after Napoleon, the British wouldn't want too many French because they didn't know whose side they were on. But migration was encouraged because the United States, the only way you can get to the resources and make money off the farmland is to have farmers, and you had to have a large number of people come in to do the work. So policy of the British was always to encourage it. Now, it's interesting, you read in there, Franklin did not like the Dutch Germans in Pennsylvania. He complained, he said, they're not very smart, they don't learn to read English. Well, they read German. I mean, they probably felt German was superior to English, so everybody's proud of their own culture. But the United States went through anti-immigrant experiences after the initial colonies, and of course you wanted more people in the United States right after independence, because if your country's not very big and has a small population, it's probably going to lose if it gets in another war with the British. And we did get into other wars with the British and even the French, 1897, 98. 1797, 98, we got in the XYZ affair, which basically was an undeclared war with France. Then we got into a war, 1812, with kind of both of them, but mainly the British, and they burnt the Capitol down and the White House. So we weren't in a position to do a lot against the British. In fact, we wanted to conquer Canada. People don't mention it, but that was one of our desires. We thought we could grab Canada and make the United States really big. And then we invaded Canada and found the Canadians wanted to stay with the British, and they helped defeat our armies trying to break through. You never hear about that because defeats are always ignored. But the 1820s, 1830s, there was a lot of anxiety, and as there was a whole 100 years later in the 20s and 30s, in which people began to be suspicious, and they didn't like the issue then was they didn't like the Catholicism of the Irish. That's before large numbers of Italians had come in or anything like that. As long as they're Protestant, people accept them, and they of course were white. People still had that definite. They thought skin color was a really significant issue. By the way, I have a handout I'm going to give you that talks about the absolute absurdity and the myth, or the what I call the lie of the term race. There is no race. Maybe there's a human race, but that's it. The idea of separating races and by color and features in different parts of the world is nonsense, total nonsense. And you know that still exists because people talk about that term, they use it, and they think that everybody knows and agrees on it. So it's like making up. It's a made-up term. It has no veracity at all. But in the 1820s and 30s, they actually had a party called the Know Nothing Party. And Know Nothing meant they claimed not to be very smart people, but they knew they didn't want foreigners in our country. And the big conflict was the Irish, because the people here spoke English and were not Catholic. They were definitely Protestants. And a lot of people had a deathly fear, as I just talked about in those scales, that people were in a very defensive or siege mentality. They felt that not Italians, they felt Irish were coming over here and that they would eventually turn the United States into a Catholic country. This may sound odd to you because I doubt if anybody here even has such anxiety about different religions. You may have some, but it's not the foremost fear. But America has always been very sensitive because the British, and I want to give you a little background on this. The British were almost conquered, or could have been conquered by Spain in 1588. The Spanish Armada was a huge invasion force sent to conquer England. The English defeated the Armada, and part of it was destroyed by storms. And so the Spanish had this big invasion like D-Day, and the whole thing fell apart. England was only conquered once, and that was by William the Conqueror. I started saying Norman the Norman. William the Conqueror in 1066 from France conquered England. And he totally took over, and he prohibited the English language. It became the language of the poor, and French was the language of the educated people, as it properly should be. No, kidding, joking. But because of the Spanish Armada, there was a deep, deep fear of English people towards Spanish people. And it was because because of Henry VIII, was Protestant, and Spain wanted to bring it back into Catholicism. The English had brutally suppressed the Catholics between the late 1500s and early 1600s. Priests, Irish were prohibited to have Catholic Mass or celebrate anything Catholic. If a priest were captured, they would be executed. Anyone who was trying to keep, things to help them to have a Mass, or they find all kinds of places in England where people in their houses had secret little rooms where they could search but never find a hiding priest or a famous Catholic person. So there were a number of people, and they were drawn and quartered in most cases. If you don't know what drawn and quartered is, 4 horses and a rope or a chain, and you've got 4 connections here, your arms and your legs, and that pretty much tells you what that is. Sometimes they parboil the intestines too, and organs. Boil them or something. Real weird. I don't know why they did it, but they did. It's kind of like the ending to Braveheart when they killed him. at the end of Braveheart. Have you ever seen that movie? And they gut him and everything. And they said the Spanish were bad at torturing. I think the English are pretty good. Okay, but American immigration has been like a pattern, and it would be that we need people in the economy. We have a lot of land, but we don't have anybody to work it. Please come, please come, please come. And then people say, okay, the economy is kind of cold now. We don't have enough jobs. We don't like these people who act differently than us and worship differently than us. We want to get rid of them. You're seeing that now. We're in the down pattern. I call it the down pattern. And then during the Civil War, people were focused on internal things, and most people said, no, I want whoever will come and fight on my side. So you'll find the Irish fighting on both sides of the Civil War, depending on whether they landed in the South or the North. You'll find German Protestants fighting against slavery because they hated slavery. So you had an interesting mix. People were so busy killing each other over politics, they forgot to kill each other over religion. After the Civil War, the United States for a long time was interested in westward expansion still. Not so much farms, but still a lot of people are coming over. I remember if any of you ever been to Silverton, Colorado, up in the mountains, you can take that little train out of Durango, I think it is, and you can go up in the mountains. It's a little town called Silverton. And literally thousands, and they call them birds, but thousands and tens of thousands of single men from Italy and Eastern Europe and stuff would come over and were hired on to be silver miners, or it could have been gold miners or any kind of miners, but mainly silver miners. And they would go up in the mountains, and their goal was to earn as much money as they could working as a miner, because there weren't any jobs in Europe. And they said, well, if you come over to America and you work for about 5 years, you can save up thousands of dollars, and then you can bring the money back to your family in Europe. Well, some of them never made it back because they either died or they decided that, I kind of forgot about them. I think I'll just have fun here and live in the United States. So that was really interesting. They talk in the text about the exception were women from Ireland who came over, who obviously spoke English because the Irish were forced to speak English, and the Irish were very poor. And they came over in droves because a lot of them worked as policemen, and the men, and the women worked as domestic servants. It was very common in the 1800s to have Irish maids. You don't really have any way of knowing this unless you just study American social history, but it's really interesting. So the Irish came in huge numbers, and part of the reason was there were no opportunities even to get married in Ireland, because Ireland had lost so much population and really didn't control its own country that a lot of people left Ireland and went to the United States to work, because they said, well, that's where the other Irish are, and you'll definitely find Irish somewhere, and some are prosperous and they'll hire you. So one of my ancestors, John Tracy, I found that he was naturalized and became a U.S. citizen at age 17 in Shelby, Kentucky in 1868 or something like that. Actually found the document, well, it was a copy of it, the document where he signed it. And it was interesting because it said, and you must also renounce any loyalty to Queen Victoria, because Americans didn't like dual citizenship. They allow it now, but in those days they said, if you become an American, you can only be an American. We don't want any German Americans. So this idea of people not liking hyphenated things like Hispanic American, Mexican American, German American, I've heard people complain about that. Kind of goes way back to the attitude that you're one of us, you're no longer part of whatever game they were in. You're in our gang now, guys. So we needed people, we kicked out people, we needed them again. Turn of the century and industrialization in the United States, you had huge factories for clothing, for power, for electricity, mining, coal. You had people come to the United States all from the early 1890s, even all the way up through the 1930s. Now, I'm from Macon, Missouri, near Macon, Missouri, in northern Missouri, and we had a big strip mine, and it was south of Bevier, Missouri, a little tiny town. And that town was basically an Italian town. Hundreds or thousands of Italians immigrated from northern Italy to Bevier, Missouri to be miners. Why did they come? Because they were expert miners in Italy. They knew how to mine coal, and they needed coal miners. And so they brought them in. A lot of people in my town of Macon ridiculed them. They made fun of them because, well, again, the religion. The people in Macon, a lot of them were not Catholic. Catholics were a distinct minority, and all the Italians were Catholic. And so when they came over, people said, you don't want to marry them, they're Catholic, you know. And so people made all kinds of really nasty remarks. I can actually remember that our neighbor, he was an Italian fellow, and that he had a girlfriend that was the daughter of the sheriff. And he married her, and that was a real scandal because he said, how can you marry a Catholic Italian guy like that? And they even made denigrating remarks about his skin color, like he wasn't white. And of course, I grew up with their kids and stuff. I never knew. The whole idea of skin color was absurd. I mean, but these people, they were mainly, I think, religion. But the fact is, they were so racist. And of course, they were siege mentality, we'll call it. But that was a case where people came over, they wanted their skills, and they wanted these people to come over. And this guy, he was born in, I think he was born in Missouri, but his father came from northern Italy. So we had large numbers of people in my graduating class in high school were Italian. They had Italian names. And what was ironic was by the 1960s, the very people that were discriminated against and talked badly about because of their religion, by the 1960s, they were the leading citizens. They were the heads of the student council. They were winning the beauty contests. They were winning the King's contest for homecoming. They were the football players. They were the upper class. And it was interesting. It was a total turnover of who used to be the big shots. In 30 years, it was a whole different group of people. Okay, so that's interesting when you have that. There was discrimination against Italians, but it wasn't that strong. And it's kind of collapsed when people started intermarrying. Then people said, well, that guy's really good looking. I don't care what religion he is. I'll be Italian. I love him, And so, boom, that was it. Same thing with the girls. So we ended up with a situation where things went pretty smoothly, but there were still African Americans that were still excluded because of the hardcore racist, and I'd call it the siege mentality, but the hardcore anti-Black attitudes that held on from the past. In fact, I discovered in a newspaper that in 1896, an African American man was accused of attacking children or people in general and stealing and hurting children. I don't know the nature of it, but anyhow, he was accused. He was not guilty. He was never tried, but they had a problem in town and they decided he was guilty. This was reported in the San Francisco newspaper, which I can still go on and get a copy of that story. And in 1896, they broke into the jail. The town, they pushed aside 3 ministers, the sheriff, the deputy sheriff, threatened to kill him, took the guy out and hung him from a railroad bridge and left his body for 3 days hanging out over the railroad until the railroad said, if you don't move that body, we're going to sue the town for $2,000 or something. So then the town had to, and they took his body and hid it somewhere, buried it in an unmarked grave. That was, and that story echoed down to when I was in school. I never heard about this story. I heard some random, and you know why I didn't hear about it? Because it's ugly and nobody wanted to tell the truth. Everybody just kept their mouth shut. Turned out the man was almost certainly innocent. he was found guilty because they had to find somebody and they were angry, so they blamed him. In fact, it was said that when he was being drugged to the bridge, they said, "Do you want us to drop you or do you want us to strangle you?" And he, dropping him would kill him quickly, be more merciful. And he looked at them and he said, "I didn't do this. I'm innocent. It doesn't matter." And so they strangled him. I believe they strangled him. And there's still rumor of where his body is located still. That someone told me the vegetation around that spot near the railroad tracks has a lot of unusual plants in it, like domestic plants that people have grown for years just to honor the fact that he was buried there without a gravestone. And that just story haunts me because that was just a pure racist act, lynching. It was lynching. And everybody in town tried to pretend it didn't happen. Afterwards, they were ashamed of it. So, and the irony is that one of the victims, who was a kid at the time, turned out to be an old substitute teacher who was a principal at one time. And she had a problem that she wasn't able to speak very well. And people said, "Well, why can't she speak very well?" Whoever attacked her almost choked her to death and damaged her vocal cords when she was a little girl. And I knew this lady, went to trick or treat and went to her house, and she always had a really rough voice. You couldn't understand her very well, like she smoked a lot. And it turned out that had been her voice all those years. And she was a victim of that attack, and this poor soul was murdered. And the real culprit was probably never caught. And so you can imagine hearing about this. I always thought that it'd be really dramatic if I went back and a group of us said, "We're going to give him a proper burial and try to find his body and bury him and share the truth about what happened to him." Or people in town wouldn't like it. They said, "Oh, I don't like that." And he said, "Yeah, my great-grandfather didn't do that." Well, I said, most of the town did it. You almost know the people that didn't do it. The rest of the people did it. Sorry, I got a little off track, but that's why stuff that's evil gets hidden, and you have to look and look and look for it. And people don't want to hear about the story when they hear it because they know maybe their great-grandpa did this, thought it was pretty cool or something. You can find all kinds of horrible cases of people being tortured. You can find cases of women being abused and stuff, or minorities or Native Americans, etc. Your job as an advocate is to see things like that don't happen now. Now, you may say, "Well, it can't happen now." I said, innocent people go to jail and go to prison and get the death penalty. Innocent people, or just kids, fail to get services that they should get. And so when we talk about these things with immigration, and it talks about the reason why people came to the United States, we happened to liberalize our immigration laws right around 1965. And a lot of people came to America on the promise. And people said, "Well, we got the Statue of Liberty, and suffering masses can come here," whatever the word is. And now we're in the year 2000, 1990s, 2019. And now people are in detention centers. People are we're building walls, and a lot of people feel, well, that's the right thing to do. And I'm really shocked. I'm not going to judge anybody in this class or anything, but you hear people say things, and then you have students who are from these groups. Students that might be Muslim students after 2001. That's in here too. It talks about, I remember how people reacted. Here's another story, and I'm going to tell it, even though I remember after 2001 hearing the most outrageous stories in my hometown, or my town of Lexington. People told me stories about Muslim people being arrested and being held in jail, and individuals trying to get a plane, and just crazy stories that had no validity at all, because every time I tried to double check on them, it was always, "Well, I heard it from him." And I went over there and they said, "We heard it from them." And they heard it from somebody else, but they're sure it's true. And there were stories that were completely unacceptable. I mean, it was like there were terrorists everywhere, and they spoke Arabic. And they were in our town, which is just a little town, and we have a big meat packing plant, but it wasn't, it, this time it was Muslims, it wasn't Hispanics. And I remember after 2001, people were reporting anyone speaking Arabic anywhere. I'm sorry. And the police were picking them up or asking questions on planes. And there were even cases of people that were, if you know the Sikhs from the state of Kashmir, they wear the turbans. Well, technically the Muslims don't wear turbans. Those are Sikhs. There is a difference. We can get into a deeper discussion about it. But guys like that were just murdered at their gas stations where they're working at a gas station. People thought they probably a terrorist, and they just killed them because they thought they were Muslim. But people felt very empowered to just go do whatever they damn well pleased. That's like the lynchings I just mentioned. Minority groups, people that are perceived as weak or people perceived as not, they shouldn't be here or something like that. And I can find these examples. This isn't American examples. I can find these examples and these patterns that I've told you about. These are all over the world. And people get very upset when you point them out. They get very upset. I could do some research and find the same thing in an African context or Latin America. It might be a social class difference. It might be a political difference. It might be a religious difference. I know in India, Hindu and Muslims have vicious things happen, just unbelievably vicious. And that's happening now sometimes. But if I brought that up to somebody in there from one of those countries, they'd be deeply offended and claim, oh, that can't be. Because people don't want to hear bad stuff, You don't go up to somebody and tell them bad stories about their own family. You should know better. But they want to avoid that. So as you read through this pattern in American immigration, and I know in these pages it talks about how Japanese and Chinese and Filipinos were not welcome in the United States. Well, for a while they were. The Chinese helped build our railroads. The stuff about John Wayne and some other guys building the railroads or guys like that. I'm sorry, cowboys had a respectable job. They weren't going to work on railroads. Railroad work was horribly difficult. But it was a lot of money for someone who was very, very poor. And we got that same thing going on now. Why do some people clean rooms in hotels? Why do some people wash dishes? And you think, well, that doesn't pay very much. But to them, it's a lot of money. You'll see some people in the New Faces on Main Street say, well, it may seem horrible to you. I'm going to cut this calf open and I'm getting $12 an hour or $20 an hour. And if I were home, I'd make $2 an hour. So I'm making 10 times the money. Think of what would happen to you if I said, oh, you can go teach a class in, I don't know, another state or another country, and you'll make 10 times your salary. And you say, what do you mean? I mean, you'll make $300,000 a year instead of 30. You're going to be out like a shot. You're going to be gone. So our immigration laws, a lot of them are predicated on economic need, at least for big business. But then now we've experienced a movement, and we've also experienced a collapse of the government of Venezuela. Central America is very dangerous. The Middle East, the collapse of Iraq and Syria, and heck, we don't know what could happen to Iran. But we see all these places, Somalia, Sudan. So we have people desperate coming in. What is it? They're desperate to survive. They're not desperate to invade. So people say a lot of negative things about it. I'm rambling a bit, and I'm probably tired. But that's what I want you to take away from this immigration book is those patterns come and go, and they're economic. But then the brakes are put on a lot of times because of racist attitudes. People are paranoid. And I'm not saying that sometimes people don't take jobs, that some groups don't assimilate very well, or at least don't blend in, however you want to call that. But I always wonder, my goal is to always argue mercy. I'm not even arguing religious mercy, I just mercy to people, and certainly to feel that toward our students. Okay, well, I'm going to shut up now. Hope this has been of some value.